An Apache scout was betrayed by the U.S. Army, but his only ally was a woman lawyer. The government land office was a sterile, indifferent box filled with the smells of stale paper, quiet contempt, and simmering betrayal. The old Apache scout Elias stood before the clerk's desk, his worn service papers a testament to 30 years of loyalty. The clerk, a man with a thin mustache, wouldn't even acknowledge the corn. He waved a dismissive hand. "The law is clear. As an Indian ward, you own nothing. You are owed nothing." Elias's face remained a mask of stone, a map of canyons and patience revealing nothing of the storm within. This was unbreakable dignity in the face of utter erasure. This wasn't just about a pension. He knew that now. This was about Colonel Hawthorne. This was about silencing the last man who remembered the day a glorious victory was truly a massacre. He was turned away, dismissed like a grub-line rider. But he'd heard whispers in the street. A different kind of law had come to this frontier town. A lawyer who was even more of an outcast than he was. A woman. And she was his last desperate shot at justice. The room smelled of stale paper and the slow, methodical erasure of a man's life. It was a sterile, indifferent box, a place where 30 years of service of tracking hostiles through blinding blizzards and guiding columns through sun-scorched canyons was reduced to a few lines of ink on a government form. Elias stood before the polished oak desk, his silence a mountain in the small, suffocating office. His service papers lay on the desk between him and the clerk, a life measured in campaigns and commendations signed by generals and colonels, a life of loyalty. The clerk, a man with a thin, prim mustache and eyes that held no light, did not look at the papers. He looked at Elias's weathered face, at his long braided hair, and saw not a decorated veteran, but an inconvenience. "The law is clear, as I've explained," the clerk said, his voice flat, and bored the tone one uses to dismiss a child. "By the statutes of this territory, as an Indian ward of the government, you are not entitled to a military pension, nor can you hold title to land." He pushed the papers back across the desk with the tips of his fingers as if they were contaminated. "You are owed nothing." Elias did not move. He did not speak. His face, a roadmap of harsh sun and hard years, remained impassive. The fury that coiled in his gut was an old, familiar beast. He had learned long ago not to let it show. He was a man who could read the subtlest sign on a windswept prairie, and he could read the dismissal in this man's soul. This was not about law, this was about erasure. He finally took his papers, his calloused fingers folding the brittle documents with a slow, deliberate reverence. He turned and walked out, his back straight, his dignity an invisible shield against the clerk's contemptuous gaze. He stepped out into the chaotic symphony of the city. The noise was a physical assault after the quiet of the plains. Iron-shod hooves clattered on stone streets. Vendors shouted their wares. A train whistle shrieked in the distance, a sound of relentless, screaming progress. He was a ghost here, a man of earth and sky adrift in a world of brick and commerce. People moved around him, their gazes sliding past him, seeing nothing but a relic, an old Indian who had somehow wandered out of the wilderness and into their civilized world. He walked without purpose, the city a labyrinth of straight lines and sharp angles that felt alien to him. He saw a cavalry officer, his uniform crisp blue and brass, laughing with a woman in a fine dress. The sight was a splinter of glass in his memory. The blue of the uniform shifted, becoming the color of the sky over a place called Willow Creek. The woman's laughter became a different sound. A scream cut short. He smelled it then, the acrid, choking scent of black powder and burning canvas. He felt the heavy kick of his Springfield rifle against his shoulder. He saw the face of Colonel Hawthorne, not the celebrated politician he was now, but the ambitious major, his eyes wild with a fever that was not from battle, but from slaughter. "This isn't about a pension," a voice whispered in the depths of his soul. "This is about Willow Creek. He's burying the witnesses. The realization settled in his gut, cold and hard as a stone. He was the last witness, the last man alive who knew that the colonel's glorious victory had been a massacre of women and children. And a hero cannot have ghosts. He was destitute and outcast in the very nation he had served. Hope was a foreign currency here. But he had heard whispers. A strange rumor passed between the downtrodden in the back alleys of the town. A name. A last desperate, improbable chance. He found the office tucked away on a side street, a small, unassuming shingle hanging above the door easily missed. It read, B. Rowe, Attorney at Law. He pushed the door open. The office was small, cluttered with books and legal papers, but it was clean. A woman sat behind a large desk, her head bent over a thick, open book. She looked up as he entered, and he was struck by the intelligence and fire in her eyes. She was young, her hair pinned up in a severe but elegant fashion, her dress practical and dark. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived in this city, he felt seen. There was no pity in her gaze, no fear, only a sharp professional curiosity. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. Elias walked forward and carefully placed his worn service papers on her desk next to her book. He met her intelligent, questioning gaze. "I'm told," he said, his own voice a low, rough thing, "that you are a person who listens to stories no one else will hear." Beatrice Rowe looked at the man who stood before her desk and saw a living piece of the very land she had only ever read about in books. He was tall, his frame lean, but radiating a strength that seemed woven into his very being. His face was a testament to a life lived under an open sky, a roadmap of sun and wind and sorrow. He did not carry the swagger of a gunslinger or the desperation of a beggar. He carried a quiet, profound dignity that was as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. And his opening words, "I am told you are a person who listens to stories no one else will hear," were not a plea. They were a challenge, a carefully chosen key offered for a lock she had not known existed. Her office was her sanctuary and her battlefield. A small, cramped room, smelling of old paper leather-bound books and the faint, ever-present scent of her own resolve. Every book on her shelves was a victory. Every legal brief she wrote a quiet act of rebellion. She was the only woman attorney in the entire territory, a fact that her male colleagues and the condescending judges never let her forget. They saw a novelty, a lady lawyer playing a man's game. She had survived on a diet of petty contract disputes, wills for widows, and the occasional impossible case that no one else would touch. This man, she sensed, was the most impossible case of all. She motioned to the chair opposite her desk. "The law is my business, sir, not stories." Her voice was professional, a carefully constructed shield she used against the world's skepticism. The old scout sat his movements deliberate. He did not relax. He simply occupied the space. Sometimes he set his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. The law is the only place left for a true story to be told. He said his name was Elias. He spoke simply, without flourish or self-pity, as he laid out the facts of his life. He told of 30 years of service as a scout for the United States Army. He spoke of campaigns in the snows of the high country and the furnaces of the southern deserts. He spoke of loyalty, of treaties, of promises made by men with braid on their shoulders. And then he spoke of the final betrayal in the cold, sterile government office. Beatrice listened, her skepticism slowly melting away, replaced by a cold, familiar anger. She examined his papers, her trained eye reading the official language, the commendations signed by famous generals, and the final damning dismissal citing a cruel and convenient territorial statute. It was a legal loophole, a racist piece of bureaucratic trickery designed to erase a debt owed to a man who was no longer deemed a citizen but a ward. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice tight with a fury she rarely allowed to show. She looked up from the papers, her gaze sharp. "But it is also a fortress. The statute is clear. To fight this, we would not just be fighting a clerk. We would be challenging the territorial government itself. It is a case designed to be unwinnable." Elias held her gaze. He had not flinched once while telling his story. "It is not the government I have come to fight," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It is a man." "A man," Beatrice repeated, leaning forward. "My final commission was under the command of Major Sterling Hawthorne," Elias said, and the name hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Hawthorne was no longer a major. He was a colonel, a celebrated hero, a powerful politician whose name was synonymous with the taming of the West. He is the man who made the promises, and he is the man who buried them. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer just a case of civil injustice. This was something far more dangerous. To challenge Colonel Hawthorne was to challenge a living legend, a man with immense power and a reputation to protect. Why, she asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions? Why would a man like Hawthorne risk his reputation over an old scout's pension? Elias was silent for a long moment. He looked out the small window, his gaze fixed on a place far beyond the brick buildings and dusty streets of the city. He was looking back in time. Because a pension can be paid, he said, his voice a near whisper. But a memory cannot be silenced so easily. He turned his gaze back to her, and she saw in his dark eyes the profound, unhealed wound of a man who had witnessed an unforgivable truth. "I am the last man who remembers what truly happened at Willow Creek." The name meant nothing to her but the way he said it. The weight of grief and horror in his voice told her everything she needed to know. This was the heart of it. This was the story no one else would hear. Beatrice Rowe looked at the old Apache scout, at his quiet dignity, at the immense dangerous truth he carried. She looked at the law books that lined her walls, symbols of a justice she so fiercely believed in, a justice that so often failed the very people who needed it most. She knew, with absolute certainty, that taking this case was professional suicide. It was a fool's errand. It would make her powerful enemies and earn her nothing but scorn, and she knew she had no other choice. She folded her hands on her desk, the quiet fire in her eyes matching his. "Tell me everything, Mr. Elias," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Tell me about the colonel, and tell me about Willow Creek." The small cluttered law office seemed to fade away as Elias spoke. The scent of old paper and ink was replaced by the high, thin scent of pine and cold dust. The ticking of the clock on Beatrice's wall was drowned out by the memory of a bugle call, a sound that had once meant duty, and now meant only damnation. Elias's voice was a low, steady monotone, a river of memory flowing through the quiet room. He spoke not with the fire of anger, but with the cold, heavy weight of a story that had been carried in silence for 20 years. He told her of Willow Creek. It had not been a war camp. It had been a place of life, a peaceful Cheyenne settlement nestled in a shallow, protected valley. The Maine warriors had been away on a great summer hunt, leaving behind the old, the very young, and the women. He had told this to Major Hawthorne. His scouting reports had been clear. He had described the smoke from the cooking fires, the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind, the absence of war ponies. Hawthorne had not listened. The man's ambition was a fever in his eyes, a hunger for a victory that would secure his promotion, his reputation. He had seen what he wanted to see: hostiles. He called it a nest of vipers. Elias recounted, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the office wall. He said we would strike at dawn. He said it would be a glorious victory. The word victory hung in the air, a poisoned thing. Beatrice listened, her hands folded on her desk, her posture perfectly still. but inside a cold, righteous fury was building. She was not just hearing a client's story, she was bearing witness to a confession. Elias's voice dropped lower, the memory pulling him under. He described the charge, the thunder of hooves on sacred ground, the screams of surprise turning to terror. He described his own part in it, the rifle hot in his hands, the orders echoing in his ears. He spoke of the man he had killed, a warrior in his prime who had charged out of a teepee, armed only with a knife, trying to protect the family within. Elias had shot him. It was the act that had broken his soul, the ghost that had ridden with him every day since. After he continued, his voice now a raw whisper after the shooting stopped. One of the young lieutenants, a boy from back east with soft eyes. He could not live with what we had done. He took his own life that night, but before he did, he left me his journal. Elias finally looked at Beatrice, and she saw the abyss of his grief. He wrote it all down, the truth. I have kept it all these years. The story ended. The ghosts of Willow Creek filled the small office, their silent screams echoing in the space between the two outcasts. The lawyer, a woman fighting for a place in a man's world. And the scout, a man denied a place in the world he had fought to build. Beatrice took a long, slow breath, her professional calm a dam against the tide of her fury. His word against yours, she said, her voice hard as steel. The word of a celebrated colonel versus an Apache scout. In their court, that's no contest. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a fierce, intelligent light. But a diary, a confession from one of his own officers, that changes things. That gives us a weapon. He will not let it come to a trial, Elias stated with grim certainty. He will not let me speak those words in a courtroom. Then our first battle is not to prove you are right. Beatrice countered, her mind already moving, mapping out the legal terrain. Our first battle is to guarantee your right to speak at all. We will file for a preliminary hearing. We won't sue for the pension directly. We will sue on the unconstitutionality of the statute that denies your rights as a veteran and a citizen. It's a narrow path, but it will force him to respond. It will drag him into the light. She stood and began to pace the small room, her energy a stark contrast to Elias's profound stillness. For the first time in months, she felt not the weight of prejudice, but the fire of a righteous fight. This was why she had become a lawyer. For this, for moments like this. The meeting concluded as dusk settled over the city. Elias left her office, the weight on his soul slightly lessened, now shared by this strange, fierce woman of the law. He walked down the darkening street, the gas lamps beginning to hiss to life, casting long, distorted shadows. He sensed them before he saw them. A shift in the air, the feeling of being watched. Two men stepped out from a dark alley blocking his path. They were not street thugs. They were dressed in fine dark suits, their faces impassive, their posture radiating a quiet professional menace. They were Hawthorne's men. "The colonel hears you're in town, old man." The first one said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "He remembers your loyal service. He advises you to stop stirring up old dust," the second one added. "The past is best left buried. For everyone's sake." Elias said nothing. He simply stood, his eyes meeting theirs, his presence a silent challenge. "There's a train leaving for the territories tomorrow at dawn," the first man continued, his voice now holding a thin, sharp edge of ice. "The colonel would consider it a great personal favor if you were on it. It would be healthier. For you and for your new lady lawyer friend." The threat was unspoken, but perfectly clear. They were not just targeting him. They were targeting her. The men melted back into the shadows of the alley, leaving Elias alone in the growing dark. The legal battle had just been declared. But the real war, the one fought in the shadows with threats and violence, had already begun. He was no longer just fighting for his past. He was fighting for her future. The war against Elias and Beatrice began not with a gunshot, but with the quiet, venomous tools of a civilized world. 2 days after their meeting, Beatrice was met at her office door by her landlord, his face a mask of nervous sweat. "Miss Rowe," he began, wringing his hands. "There have been complaints about your clientele. It's making the other tenants uneasy. I'm afraid I'll have to terminate your lease." Beatrice's anger was a cold, sharp blade. This was Colonel Hawthorne's work. He would not use thugs, not at first. He would use the subtle weapons of prejudice and commerce to strangle her practice. "Are you referring to a specific city ordinance, Mr. Gable?" she asked, her voice precise and cutting. "Or are you practicing housing discrimination based on a client's race, a matter I would be delighted to litigate in open court? I'm sure the Daily Chronicle would find it most illuminating." The landlord paled and retreated, but the message had been delivered. They were trying to make her an outcast. While Beatrice fought her war in rooms of paper and veiled threats, Elias fought his in the alleys and shadows. He felt the hunters around him, a change in the rhythm of the street. He was a man of the wilderness, and the city was just a different kind of canyon. He spotted a man trying too hard to look casual across the street, and without breaking stride turned into a crowded saloon. He moved through the haze of smoke and noise past the bar and out the back door into a narrow alley, emerging on a parallel street a block away. From the shadows he watched as his follower came running out of the saloon's front door. Moments later, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Elias let a grim, humorless smile touch his lips. They thought him a simple savage. They did not understand that a man who can survive a desert with nothing but a knife can survive anything. They met that night in the cavernous, echoing silence of the city library, a place Hawthorne's brutes would never think to look. They sat in a remote alcove, surrounded by the ghosts of law and history. "They are following me," Elias stated simply. "Soldiers, not thugs. They are waiting for a chance. And they are trying to bleed me dry," Beatrice countered, her voice tight with a cold fury. "They sent a man to my office to speak of accidents." She looked at the old scout, at the profound weariness in his eyes, and her resolve hardened. "They are afraid of you, Elias. Of your story. That is why they are doing this. Fear makes men like him more dangerous," he said. Yes, she agreed, a dangerous light in her own eyes, which is why we cannot wait for them to make the next move. We must make it for them. They think they can isolate us in the dark. So we will drag this fight into the light. She pulled 2 documents from her satchel. "This is an emergency petition to the circuit judge demanding a hearing on the statute that denies your rights. It will force Hawthorne's name into the official record." She then held up a second sealed envelope. "And this is a letter to Jacob Reese at the Daily Chronicle. It does not mention the massacre. It simply states the facts. A decorated Apache scout is being silenced by a celebrated war hero who is using threats to deny him his legal rights." Elias understood the gamble instantly. It was a move of profound risk. To do this was to openly challenge the colonel to invite his full, unrestrained wrath. "This is a declaration of war," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The war was declared at Willow Creek." Beatrice replied, her voice fierce and clear. "We are merely firing back." She gave the letter to a trusted page at the library's front desk with instructions to deliver it that night. As the boy disappeared into the darkness, Beatrice and Elias stood together in the silent hall. They had thrown down the gauntlet. There was no turning back now. The colonel's response would not be a legal brief. It would be swift, and it would be brutal. The ink on the morning's edition of the Daily Chronicle was barely dry, but its effect was a firestorm. The headline was a declaration of war splashed across the front page in bold, accusatory type. "War hero accused of injustice. Loyal Apache. Scout denied rights." The city which had ignored Elias's existence was now forced to see him. Beatrice's gamble had worked. They were no longer in the shadows, they were in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the public eye. For some, they were villains, a slanderous woman, and a greedy Indian attacking a beloved hero. For others, the downtrodden and the forgotten, they were a flicker of impossible hope. Colonel Hawthorne's response was, as they had predicted, swift and brutal. The threat against Beatrice came in a sealed envelope delivered by a court messenger. It was a formal notice of a disbarment hearing. The charges were flimsy, absurd, unprofessional conduct bringing the noble profession of the law into disrepute. It was a clear, vicious attempt to destroy her career, to strip her of the only weapon she had. She read the document, a cold fury settling in her heart, and then she carefully filed it away. It was just another battlefront. The threat against Elias was more direct. As he walked down a crowded street near the city market, the world exploded in a shower of splintered wood, just inches from his head. A gunshot. It came from a high window across the street, a single anonymous crack lost in the noise of the city. People screamed and scattered. It was designed to look like a stray bullet, a tragic accident in a rough-and-tumble town. Elias did not flinch. He did not run. He simply melted into the chaos of the crowd, his movements fluid as water, and vanished. He knew what it was. Not an accident. A warning shot. The first, and likely the last. The next one would not miss. The courtroom was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. It was packed to the rafters with journalists, curious townspeople, glowering veterans loyal to the colonel, and a few brave souls who had come to support the outcasts. The air was thick with sweat anticipation, and the weight of a generation of secrets. Colonel Sterling Hawthorne sat in the front row, the very picture of wronged dignity. He was flanked by a high-priced lawyer from back east, a man with a cruel, thin smile, and a reputation for burying his opponents in legal maneuvering. Beatrice and Elias sat alone at their small table. They looked small, isolated. An army of two against a legend. The judge, a man whose political career was deeply indebted to Hawthorne, called the court to order. Hawthorne's lawyer was immediately on his feet. "Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal." He began, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "This entire affair is a shameful, baseless fantasy concocted by a disgruntled native and an attention-seeking lady lawyer whose unprofessional conduct is already under review by the bar. It is a waste of this court's valuable time and an insult to the reputation of a great American hero." The courtroom murmured in agreement. Beatrice felt the weight of their judgment a physical force, but she did not waver. She rose to her feet, her presence commanding a sudden silence. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, refusing to be baited. "My opponent is correct. This is not about a pension. It is not about a land grant. It is about something far more fundamental." She paused, letting her words settle. "This is a test of a single simple question. Does 30 years of decorated loyal service to the United States Army grant a man the right to have his story heard in a court of law, or does the fact of his Apache blood erase that right entirely? That is all we are here to decide today. Whether the laws of this territory apply to all its veterans or only to some." She had turned their own argument against them. She had framed it not as an attack on a hero, but as a defense of the law itself. The judge, a man keenly aware of the journalists scribbling notes in the front row, was trapped. To dismiss the case now would be to admit that justice in his courtroom was indeed determined by race. He scowled, his face darkening. "The court will hear the petitioner's testimony," he grumbled. "But be warned, Miss Rowe. This is not a saloon for telling tall tales. You will stick to the facts." "Of course, Your Honor." Beatrice said, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips. It was the first victory. She had won him the right to speak. She turned to her client. The petitioner calls Mr. Elias to the stand. A hush fell over the room as Elias rose and walked to the witness stand. He moved with a quiet, unhurried grace, his presence a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the court. He placed his hand on the Bible, his expression solemn. Beatrice approached the stand. This was the moment. The culmination of all their risks, all their fear. "Mr. Elias," she began, her voice echoing in the silent waiting room. "For the record, would you please state your name and your relationship to Colonel Sterling Hawthorne?" Elias turned his head slightly, his dark, piercing gaze finding the colonel in the front row, holding it for a long, profound moment. "My name is Elias," he said, his voice low and clear. "And I was his scout." He paused, letting the weight of history settle into the single final phrase. "At a place called Willow Creek." The name Willow Creek hung in the air of the courtroom, a ghost summoned into the light. Colonel Hawthorne for the first time flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. The judge leaned forward, his expression a mixture of impatience and intrigue. And Elias began to speak. His voice did not rise, it did not break. It was a low, steady current, a river of memory flowing through the silent room. He painted a picture not of war, but of peace, a Cheyenne village in the quiet of a summer morning, the scent of cooking fires, the sound of children laughing. He spoke of his own scouting report delivered to a young Major Hawthorne hungry for glory, a report that spoke of old men and women and the absence of warriors, a report that was ignored. Then his voice changed, taking on the hard, sharp edge of memory. He spoke of the bugle call at dawn, the thunder of a cavalry charge against a sleeping village. He spoke of the screams, the chaos, the acrid smell of black powder. He did not speak of heroes or villains. He spoke only of what he saw: a woman running from a burning teepee, a small child in her arms cut down by a volley of rifle fire. An old man raising a ceremonial pipe in a gesture of peace shot from his horse. The courtroom was utterly still, caught in the grip of his harrowing, unadorned testimony. Beatrice watched the faces of the jury, of the journalist. Their skepticism had dissolved, replaced by a pale, dawning horror. She saw Hawthorne's facade of heroic dignity beginning to crack, his face a mask of white-hot fury. Elias's story culminated in a quiet tent after the slaughter was over. "A lieutenant," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "a boy from Pennsylvania. He could not clean the blood from his soul. He gave me his journal, and then he used his service revolver to find his own peace." "Objection!" Hawthorne's lawyer roared, leaping to his feet. "This is a slanderous fabrication, a dead man's diary that no one has ever seen. It proves nothing." The judge's gavel slammed down. Objection sustained. "Miss Rowe, without proof, this is nothing but a story." "We have proof, Your Honor." Beatrice said, her voice clear and calm. She rose and walked forward, her steps echoing in the silent room. She placed the small, worn, leather-bound diary on the judge's bench. It landed with a soft, final thud. The sworn final testimony of Lieutenant Robert Davies, she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced the room. "Written the night he took his own life, unable to live with the glorious victory he had been a part of." A sensation erupted. The judge, his face ashen, stared at the diary as if it were a coiled snake. He was trapped. The newspaper men were already scribbling furiously. To dismiss this would be an admission of a cover-up. His gavel fell at sound, no longer a command but a surrender. "This court finds that the petitioner's case has merit," he declared, his voice strained. "A full federal investigation into the events at Willow Creek and into the conduct of Colonel Sterling Hawthorne is hereby warranted." It was over. Hawthorne, his face a ruin of disbelief and rage, stormed from the courtroom, his legend shattered. Later on, the courthouse steps, the crowd and the journalist finally gone, Elias and Beatrice stood together in the fading afternoon light. The weight of 20 years had lifted from the old scout's shoulders. He was no longer a ghost. You gave a voice to the dead Miss Rowe. He said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound gratitude. She looked up at the old warrior at the quiet dignity that had started this impossible fight. You, Mr. Elias, she replied, a small, tired smile on her lips, gave me a truth worth fighting for. He nodded slowly, and for the first time he looked up at the vast western sky not as a man running from his past, but as a man who was finally, truly home. That final verdict, Elias's unwavering testimony echoing through those courtroom walls, struck deeper than any gunshot. What would you have risked to wrest the truth from years of silence? If Elias's courage moved you, tap like and leave a comment below. Tell me what justice means to you. Up next step, right up for the final chorus where Lila Monroe's lone harmonica will spark a revolution under the big top. Don't miss a note, subscribe and hit the bell so you're first in the front row.